History tells us that empires fall slowly, that power fades over centuries, that rebellions are small, desperate, and usually fail. But that story is only true when the empire gets to write it. What if one of the largest ancient revolts ever launched against China was almost completely erased from history? Not forgotten by accident, not lost to time, but deliberately reduced, fragmented, and rewritten until it no longer resembled the truth. And what if the leaders of that revolt were not kings, not generals, not emperors, but two women, no crowns, no dynastic armies, no imperial banners, just two figures rising from the edge of a conquered world, in a time when women were never meant to lead, never meant to command armies, and never meant to challenge empires, yet somehow they did. For nearly 2,000 years, their story has survived only in fragments. A line in an imperial chronicle, a sentence buried in a foreign archive, a legend dismissed as myth, a rebellion reduced to a footnote. Because empires don't just conquer land, they conquer memory. They decide which wars matter, which defeats are recorded, and which victories are quietly buried. This story is not taught in most schools. It rarely appears in global history books. And when it does, it is often stripped of its scale, its coordination, and its meaning. You may have never heard of it, but at its height, this uprising shattered imperial control across an entire region. Fortified cities collapsed. Colonial administrations vanished overnight. Local rulers defected. Supply lines were severed. And an empire, one of the most powerful of the ancient world, lost control of the South. All of it triggered by a decision meant to intimidate. A single execution. A calculated act of fear. The empire believed that killing one man would prevent rebellion. Instead, it ignited something far more dangerous. Because what followed was not a riot, not a local disturbance, not a peasant revolt. It was a coordinated uprising across dozens of strongholds, executed with a speed and scale that should not have been possible under colonial rule. And the most unsettling part, the deeper historians look, the more contradictions appear. Numbers don't match. Timelines fracture. Imperial records disagree with one another. One source claims the rebellion collapsed quickly. Another quietly admits it took years to suppress. One claims the leaders were captured. Another says they vanished. One insists the empire restored order easily. Another reveals massive troop losses and devastating disease among imperial forces. These are not minor discrepancies. They are the fingerprints of something being concealed. Because when history is clear, records align. But when history is inconvenient, it fractures. And this fracture begins with a question. Few historians ever pause to ask, how could two women, in the 1st century of the Common Era, mobilize an entire population against one of the largest empires on Earth? How could a society under colonial rule coordinate resistance across such a vast area? Without modern communication, without centralized bureaucracy, without standing armies? And how could this happen in a part of the world imperial historians later described as primitive, backward, and easily subdued? Those claims cannot all be true at the same time. Either the rebellion was small, or the response would not have required massive mobilization. Either the leaders were insignificant, or the empire would not have pursued them so relentlessly. Either the region was weak, or it would not have resisted so fiercely. Something doesn't add up, and when history doesn't add up, it usually means someone benefited from the confusion. Because throughout history, empires have always feared one thing more than defeat: inspiration. A successful rebellion is dangerous, but a remembered one is lethal, so the story was reshaped. Motives were minimized, leaders were personalized and trivialized. The uprising was framed not as a liberation movement, but as an emotional reaction, not politics, not sovereignty, not resistance. Just grief, just anger, just women acting out of personal loss. That framing matters, because if the rebellion was emotional, it can be dismissed. If it was personal, it can be contained. If it was irrational, it doesn't threaten the legitimacy of empire. But if it was deliberate, if it was coordinated, if it was rooted in an existing political and cultural system, then the story changes. Then this was not a rebellion against bad governance. It was a rejection of imperial rule itself. And that is a much more dangerous idea, especially when it succeeds. For a brief moment in history, imperial authority in the South collapsed. Colonial officials fled. Imperial symbols were destroyed. Local leadership was restored. And at the center of it all stood two women, whose names the empire would spend centuries trying to control. They would be remembered, but only partially, honored, but safely, celebrated, but stripped of their threat. Their story would survive, but not their power. Because power is what empires fear most. This documentary is not about legend. It is about what remains when legend is peeled back. It is about contradictions buried in imperial records, about silences that speak louder than words, about why some wars are remembered and others are reduced to myth. And it begins here, before dates, before names, before places. It begins with a realization that one of the most extraordinary revolts of the ancient world was led by those history told us never ruled. And that the reason you have never truly heard this story is not because it was small, but because it was too big to survive intact. In the first century of the Common Era, there was one power in East Asia that shaped the fate of millions, the Han Dynasty. If you lived in the West, this empire would have been the Ramang Empire of the East, vast, centralized, confident in its civilizing mission. It expanded not only with armies, but with ideology, law, language, customs, and above all, the belief that everything beyond its borders was meant to be absorbed. To the Han court, the world was not made of equals. There was the center, and there was everything else. The center ruled. The periphery complied. And south of the empire's heartland lay a region that imperial historians would later describe as unruly, backward, and in need of control. But that description tells us more about the empire than it does about the people who lived there. Because this southern world was not empty, not primitive, not chaotic. It had rulers, laws, rituals, trade networks, and a social structure that had existed for centuries. Its people called themselves Viet Lac. They did not live in a centralized empire. They lived in a federation of communities, bound by shared culture, shared ancestry, and shared symbols of authority. Power was local, but not disorganized. Leadership flowed through clans, elders, and military elites, and unlike the Han world, this society was not rigidly patriarchal. Women did not stand at the margins of power. They inherited land. They commanded respect. They could lead. To the Han Empire, this was unacceptable. Because empires do not tolerate systems they cannot fully control. When the Han expanded southward, they did not simply conquer territory. They colonized it. And colonial rule follows a pattern that repeats throughout history. First, you remove local sovereignty. Then you install imperial officials. Then you impose foreign law. Then you begin cultural transformation. Language changes, dress changes, rituals are discouraged. Symbols of authority are dismantled, and resistance is labeled disorder. The southern regions were not integrated as equal provinces. They were treated as frontier colonies, taxed, exploited, managed by governors who answered only to the imperial center. These governors were not there to govern. They were there to extract resources, labor, submission, and for decades, imperial control remained fragile because beneath the surface, local structures endured, village networks remained intact, clan loyalties persisted, communication moved faster than imperial decrees. The empire could occupy the land, but it could not replace the society. This is the reality colonial records rarely admit, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that imperial authority was never complete, that beneath the appearance of order, there was constant tension. The Han court knew this, which is why southern territories were governed differently, with harsher laws, stricter punishments, and governors given wide discretion. And discretion in empires often turns into abuse. One such governor would become infamous, not because he was unique, but because he pushed the system too far. He represented everything colonial rule relied on: fear, coercion, and the assumption that submission could be enforced indefinitely. Taxes increased. Labor demands intensified. Local elites were pressured. Traditional authority was undermined. And the deeper imperial law penetrated daily life, the clearer it became. This was no longer coexistence. It was erasure. For the Viet Lac, this wasn't simply about hardship, it was about survival. Because when an empire dismantles symbols, it is not just changing customs. It is rewriting identity. The Han legal system did not recognize local law. Han rituals replaced indigenous ones. Imperial norms redefined what was civilized, and any resistance, no matter how measured, was treated as rebellion. But what imperial records later describe as rebellion often begins as refusal. Refusal to abandon language. Refusal to abandon leadership structures. Refusal to surrender autonomy. Refusal to disappear. And this refusal was widespread. It was not confined to one valley, one settlement, one clan. It stretched across the southern world, which is why the empire feared coordination more than violence. A riot can be crushed, but coordination suggests organization, and organization suggests legitimacy. That is what made this situation volatile. The empire had conquered territory, but not consent. It had imposed governors, but not loyalty. It had declared victory, but not peace. For years, the situation simmered. And then came a decision that would change everything. An execution meant as a warning, a message sent not just to one family, but to an entire region. The empire believed this act would demonstrate strength. Instead, it exposed weakness, because it revealed what colonial rule always underestimates, that beneath imposed order, people are watching, waiting, and when the moment comes, they do not rise as individuals, they rise as a system. This is the context imperial historians prefer to minimize, because acknowledging it means admitting that what followed was not spontaneous. It was inevitable. The rebellion did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from structure, from networks already in place, from leadership already respected, from a society already capable of mobilization, which is why, when the uprising finally came, it did not look like desperation. It looked like preparation. And that is where the story becomes truly dangerous to empire. Because when colonial subjects rise as a coordinated whole, the myth of imperial superiority collapses, and that collapse is exactly what the Han Dynasty was about to face. The empire did not stumble into this moment by accident. By the time the Han governor realized what was happening in the south, the signs were already there. Local leaders were meeting more frequently. Messages moved quietly between settlements. Tax quotas were resisted, not openly but deliberately. Imperial authority was being obeyed on the surface and hollowed out underneath. This is how resistance begins. When people understand the cost of failure, the governor knew something was coming. And empires, when they sense danger, rarely ask why. They ask how to stop it. He could have negotiated. He could have reduced pressure. He could have attempted compromise. Instead, he chose fear. A single execution, targeted, public, symbolic. The victim was not a rebel commander, not a general, not a known insurgent. He was the husband of a woman. The empire already considered dangerous, a local noblewoman, well-connected, respected across multiple regions. The message was unmistakable. This was not punishment, it was intimidation. The governor believed that by removing one man, he could fracture an entire network. That by striking at the family, he would force submission. That grief would silence resistance. This logic has repeated itself across empires for thousands of years, and it has almost always failed. Because fear does not erase power, it reveals it. The woman he targeted was not a grieving widow hidden from public life. She was already a political figure, born into a lineage that predated imperial rule, raised within a culture that did not exclude women from authority, connected by blood, marriage, and alliance. To leaders across the region, her name was Trying Trick. And long before her husband's execution, she was already being watched. Not because she carried weapons, but because she carried legitimacy in colonial systems. Legitimacy is more dangerous than violence. Violence can be crushed. Legitimacy spreads. Trying Trick represented something the empire could not control. She was not appointed. She was not imposed. She was recognized by elders, by warriors, by families who traced their ancestry back generations. Her authority did not come from the empire. It came from the people the empire ruled. And when the governor ordered the execution, he misunderstood the nature of the threat. He believed resistance was personal, but it was political. He believed removing one man would destabilize a movement. But the movement was already larger than any single individual. The execution did not create resistance. It clarified it. In the aftermath, the empire expected silence. Instead, something else happened. Meetings became more open. Messages moved faster. Local leaders stopped pretending compliance. Grief transformed into resolve. Not rage, not chaos, resolve. Because for Trying Trick, this was never about revenge alone. Revenge burns hot and burns out. What followed did not burn out, it organized. She did not issue emotional calls to violence. She issued decisions. She did not appeal only to loss. She appealed to memory, to the shared past before imperial rule, to customs still practiced quietly, to symbols the empire was trying to erase. She spoke not as a victim, but as a leader, and that distinction matters. Because colonial records later worked very hard to frame this moment as personal tragedy, a woman driven by grief, a rebellion born of emotion. It is a convenient narrative. Because it strips the uprising of strategy, it removes intent. It suggests instability, not resistance. But that narrative collapses the moment you examine what happened next. Within weeks, alliances formed across regions that had no reason to coordinate spontaneously. Local commanders committed forces, supply routes were prepared, communication lines activated. This was not reaction. It was execution, the execution of a plan that had been waiting for a trigger. And Trying Trick was not alone. Her position connected multiple power centers. Her family lineage anchored her in one region. Her marriage tied her to another. Her reputation extended further still. This mattered because colonial rule relies on fragmentation, divide communities, isolate leaders, prevent coordination. But Trying Trick existed at the intersection of networks the empire could not fully see. The governor thought he was cutting off a head. Instead, he struck a nerve. And the response exposed a truth imperial administrators preferred to ignore. The South was not passive, it was patient. The uprising did not erupt everywhere at once. It unfolded. Strongholds fell in rapid sequence, not randomly, but strategically. Imperial officials fled before battles were fought. Local garrisons dissolved rather than resist. Entire administrations vanished. This does not happen without preparation, and it does not happen without leadership that people trust. The execution that was meant to terrorize instead unified, because it confirmed what local leaders already believed, that coexistence was no longer possible. That colonial rule would escalate indefinitely. That waiting would only make submission permanent. And so the moment arrived. Not because the empire lost control, but because it revealed it never truly had it. Trying Trick did not crown herself. She was elevated, not by decree, but by consensus. A consensus that crossed gender, region, and class. That alone should have terrified the empire. Because empires understand one thing very clearly. When legitimacy shifts, force follows. And once force follows, memory becomes impossible to erase. What began as an execution became a catalyst. What was meant to intimidate became an invitation, not to chaos, but to reclamation. And for the first time in generations, imperial rule in the South faced something it could not easily categorize. This was not rebellion driven by hunger. It was not banditry. It was not a revolt of the desperate. It was leadership emerging from a society that had never fully surrendered itself. And that is why the empire would later work so hard to control how this moment was remembered. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting this. That the spark was not emotion, it was recognition. Recognition that the time had come. And recognition that the person capable of uniting the resistance had already been standing in plain sight. What happened next should not have been possible. Not according to imperial logic, not according to conventional history, not according to the way revolts are supposed to work. Within months, over 60 fortified cities collapsed. Not over decades, not over generations, months. Entire regions rose simultaneously. Not sequentially, not chaotically, at the same time. This was not a riot. Riots burn fast and die young. They lack coordination. They exhaust themselves. This was something else. This was a coordinated liberation, and that is the moment history begins to fracture. Because when historians later tried to explain this event, they ran into a problem they could not resolve. How could two women, without an imperial army, without a centralized state, without written orders moving across the land, mobilize resistance on this scale? How could fortified cities fall? without prolonged sieges? How could colonial administrations vanish without decisive battles recorded? How could an empire lose control so quickly and yet insist it was never truly threatened? These questions have haunted the record for nearly 2,000 years, and the answers were never meant to be explored. Because once you explore them, the official narrative collapses. The empire wanted this remembered as a local disturbance. But disturbances do not erase entire systems of control. They do not topple administrative centers. They do not trigger mass defections. They do not spread across vast distances. With synchronized timing, what unfolded here followed a very different logic. A logic of preparation, a logic of memory, a logic of networks that existed long before imperial occupation. The cities that fell were not random. They were nodes, administrative hubs, military outposts, symbols of foreign authority. When they collapsed in a pattern like dominoes, but only because the ground beneath them had already been hollowed out. Imperial officials fled not because they were defeated, but because they realized they were isolated. Supply lines failed. Local collaborators disappeared. Communication broke down. An empire that relied on bureaucracy suddenly found itself blind. This does not happen without internal support. And this is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable for imperial historians. Because the success of the uprising implies something they tried to deny. That colonial rule in the South had never replaced indigenous authority. It had only layered itself on top. Beneath the imperial facade, local leadership structures remained intact. Village networks, clan hierarchies, warrior bands, ritual centers. When the signal was given, these structures activated simultaneously. No empire can suppress a population that already knows how to organize itself, and the signal did not come from chaos. It came from legitimacy. Trying Trick did not command through fear. She commanded through recognition. Her authority did not need to be announced. It was acknowledged. That distinction matters because revolutions driven by ideology often fracture under pressure, but revolts driven by shared identity move as one. The empire struggled to explain this, so later records reduced it. They minimized the scope. They compressed the timeline. They blurred geography. They turned a continental movement into a regional incident because acknowledging the truth would raise an even more dangerous question. If this many people rose at once, what were they restoring? The answer is unsettling. They were not creating something new. They were reclaiming something old, a system that had never fully disappeared. A cultural order that imperial law failed to erase. This was not an uprising born in the moment. It was a reactivation. And that is why the speed was shocking. Because reactivation is faster than invention, the empire expected resistance to emerge slowly. It expected negotiations, petitions, local unrest. What it faced instead was simultaneous withdrawal of consent. The people did not attack the empire everywhere. They simply stopped sustaining it. Administrators had no authority without cooperation. Garrisons had no supplies without local support. Courts had no legitimacy without recognition. Power evaporated. This is why battles are strangely absent from early accounts. There was little to fight. The empire was present, but unsupported. And then came the numbers. 65 cities. The number appears repeatedly. Quietly, almost reluctantly. And historians have argued about it ever since. How could there be 65 fortified cities in a region imperial maps later described as limited? The math does not work unless the geography is wrong, and that is the point. The uprising was never confined to the narrow boundaries later assigned to it. It extended far beyond, across river systems, across mountain corridors, across cultural zones. The empire would later claim as its own. This was not a rebellion of one province. It was a movement across an entire civilization zone. And this is where the comparison matters. Western audiences often reach for familiar analogies. Joan of Arc, a young woman leading armies, defying expectations, but this comparison fails. Joan of Arc fought for a king within an existing state, against a foreign occupier with noble backing. What happened here was larger. This was not a symbolic rally. This was not a single campaign. This was closer to a continental uprising. Multiple regions acting independently, yet in coordination. Multiple leaders operating autonomously, yet aligned. Multiple fronts collapsing simultaneously. This is not heroism. This is infrastructure. And infrastructure does not emerge overnight. Which brings us to the question imperial historians never wanted asked. If this was possible, why was it not repeated more often? The answer lies in what happened next, because the empire learned. It learned that controlling land was not enough. It needed to control memory, symbols, communication, culture. The uprising exposed vulnerabilities the empire could not allow to remain visible. So after military response came something else. Something quieter, something more permanent. But before that could happen, the empire had to do one thing first. It had to reclaim the narrative, because a successful rebellion is not just a military failure. It is a philosophical one. It challenges the idea that empire is inevitable, that submission is natural, that resistance is futile, and when resistance succeeds, even briefly, it proves the opposite. That is why the uprising had to be reframed. Not as liberation, but as chaos, not as coordination, but as coincidence, not as leadership, but as emotional reaction. Two women did not organize a continent. The empire insisted. It was impossible, and yet the evidence remains. In the speed of collapse, in the scale of mobilization, in the desperation of the response, empires do not overreact to minor threats. They overreact to existential ones, and what happened here was existential because it demonstrated that imperial control was never absolute, that beneath occupation, entire societies can endure, waiting, and when the moment comes they can rise together, not as fragments, but as a whole. Empires don't just conquer land, they rewrite memory. And the moment this uprising succeeded, the struggle over territory was no longer the most important battle. The struggle over history was, because once the empire regained control, it faced a problem that could not be solved with soldiers. Too many people had seen what happened. Too many cities had fallen. Too many officials had fled. Too many regions had acted together. The event could not be erased, so it had to be reshaped. And the first step in reshaping history was deciding who was allowed to write it. Here is where the silence begins. The earliest surviving written histories from the people who led this uprising appear more than 1400 years later. Not because nothing was recorded, but because what was recorded did not survive. Texts were destroyed, archives dismantled, local records disappeared. What remains of early indigenous history comes to us through fragments, compiled centuries after the fact. By contrast, the empire that suppressed the uprising kept meticulous records. Official chronicles, court histories, military reports. These texts became the foundation for how the story would be remembered. And that alone should raise suspicion, because history written exclusively by the victor is rarely neutral, especially when the victor was humiliated. The imperial records acknowledge the uprising, but reluctantly. They describe it as brief, localized, disorganized. They attribute it not to systemic resistance, but to the personal cruelty of a single official, a bad governor, an unfortunate incident, an overreaction. This framing is convenient, because if the uprising was caused by one corrupt man, then the empire itself remains blameless. The system is sound. Only the administrator failed. This is a familiar tactic. Empires often blame individual incompetence to avoid confronting structural rejection, but the documents betray themselves. Because while the narrative shrinks the uprising, the response reveals panic, large troop mobilizations, extended campaigns, years of military operations. These do not align with a minor disturbance. They align with loss of control. And then there are the contradictions, timelines that do not match, casualty numbers that shift, descriptions that quietly change between texts. One account claims the rebellion collapsed quickly. Another admits resistance continued for years. One claims the leaders were killed early. Another places them elsewhere, much later. One insists the region was pacified. Another records massive disease and attrition among imperial forces. These are not translation errors. They are narrative fractures. When a story is consistent, it repeats cleanly. When it is manipulated, it splinters. Nowhere is this more visible than in the most troubling detail of all. The number 65 fortified cities. The figure appears in imperial records, almost in passing. It should not be there, because by the empire's own geographic definitions, there should not have been that many cities in the region. Historians noticed this long ago. Some argued the number was exaggerated. Others claimed city meant something smaller. Administrative centers, villages, but these explanations fail. Because the text described fortifications, command centers, military importance, and because the empire responded as if it had lost strategic control. The only way the number makes sense is if the geography has been narrowed. If the uprising occurred across a much wider region than later histories admit. And that is exactly what the records suggest, if you read them closely. Place names appear that later disappear from maps. Campaign routes extend beyond official boundaries. Commands reference regions that were later reclassified as Imperial heartland. This is not coincidence. This is cartographic erasure. By redefining borders after the fact, the empire reduced the scale of what it had lost. A continental uprising became a regional rebellion. And then there is the silence around symbols. Empires fear symbols more than armies, because symbols carry memory. And memory inspires repetition. One symbol in particular terrified the imperial response: bronze drums. To outsiders they were instruments. To the people who used them, they were far more. They were authority. They signaled leadership. They summoned warriors. They coordinated movement across distance. In a world without written orders, the sound of bronze carried power. It was communication. It was command. It was identity. Imperial officials understood this, which is why, after the uprising was suppressed, they did something revealing. They confiscated the drums, not a few, not symbolic ones, all of them they could find. They melted them down, turned them into imperial objects, weapons, symbols of conquest. Official records present this act casually, almost as an aside. A general fond of horses, metal repurposed. But this was not recycling, it was cultural warfare. Destroy the drums, and you destroy the network. Destroy the sound, and you silence coordination. Destroy the symbol, and you break continuity. This was not about metal, it was about erasing the mechanism. That made the uprising possible. And this act tells us something critical. The empire did not believe the rebellion was accidental. It believed it could happen again. That is why it targeted communication. That is why it targeted culture. That is why it targeted memory. And that is why the historical record became so carefully managed. The leaders were redefined, their motives reframed, their success minimized. They were no longer political figures. They were emotional actors, no longer strategists, but symbols, safe ones, because symbols can be celebrated without threatening the present. This is why the story survived, but only partially. Enough to honor, not enough to inspire. Enough to remember names, not enough to understand power. The deeper you examine the sources, the clearer the pattern becomes. Whenever the uprising appears strong, the explanation shifts. Whenever coordination is evident, the narrative personalizes. Whenever legitimacy emerges, it is dismissed as coincidence. And whenever the empire suffers, the cause becomes climate, disease, or terrain. Never resistance, never defeat, never rejection. This is not unique. Every empire does this. Rome did it. Britain did it. Spain did it. The record of empire is always a record of justification. But what makes this case extraordinary is how much still leaked through. Despite centuries of filtering, the cracks remain in the numbers that don't align, in the regions that don't fit, in the panic hidden behind restraint. History tried to bury this uprising, but it failed. Because erasure is never complete, it leaves traces. And those traces tell a different story. A story of scale, of coordination, of leadership. A story not of chaos, but of capability. And once you see that story, you can never unsee it. Because the question is no longer whether history was manipulated. The question becomes, what else was lost when the empire decided this memory was too dangerous to preserve? When the empire finally responded, it did not send a diplomat. It sent a man who understood something far more dangerous than violence. Ma Yuan did not arrive simply to defeat armies. He arrived to end the possibility that this could ever happen again. And that distinction changes everything. Because military victories fade, cultures endure. Ma Yuan understood that swords alone could not secure the South. He was not facing a disorganized population. He was facing a society that had proven it could coordinate, mobilize, and reclaim power without imperial permission. That terrified the court. So the campaign that followed was not only about punishment, it was about dismantlement. The empire's objective was no longer to win battles. It was to break systems. The armies moved in waves. Land forces pressing through valleys, naval forces advancing along river networks. But wherever Ma Yuan went, he targeted the same things. Not just fighters, but connectors, leaders, messengers, symbols. Because Ma Yuan understood a principle that modern counterinsurgency would later formalize. If you destroy the network, the movement collapses, and the most powerful network was not military. It was cultural. At the heart of that culture stood an object the empire had long misunderstood, until it was nearly destroyed by it. the bronze drum. To an outsider, it looked ceremonial, decorative, ancient, primitive. To the society that built it, it was none of those things. It was authority made audible. The drums summoned warriors, announced assemblies, marked ritual time, confirmed leadership. Its sound traveled farther than a voice, faster than a messenger. It was command. In a world without written orders, the drum was governance. When the drum sounded, people did not ask why, they moved. That is how coordination happened without bureaucracy. That is how entire regions could rise within days. The empire learned this lesson the hard way. So Ma Yuan issued an order that was never framed as cultural annihilation. It was described as logistics. Confiscate the drums. All of them, not just from strongholds, but from villages, from ritual centers, from clan halls. Anything that resonated had to disappear. The metal was collected, melted, recast. Official records would later describe this, almost casually. Bronze repurposed into imperial weapons, into statues, into symbols of conquest. But this was not efficiency. It was erasure. Because when you destroy the drums, you destroy the signal. Without the signal, coordination collapses. Without coordination, resistance fragments. Without memory, identity weakens. This was not symbolic violence, it was structural violence. And it worked, because after the drums fell silent, nothing else sounded the same. Messages moved slower. Assemblies took longer to form. Local authority weakened. The empire did not need to fight everywhere anymore. It had severed the system that made resistance scalable. But Ma Yuan went further. He did not simply remove symbols, he replaced them. Imperial law was imposed. Not gradually, but decisively. Local legal customs were dismissed. Foreign statutes enforced. Where negotiation once existed, compliance was now demanded. Local elites were stripped of autonomy or absorbed into the imperial hierarchy. Those who resisted were removed. Those who complied were rewarded. This was not chaos. It was integration on imperial terms, and it was intentional. Because Ma Yuan's mission was not only to restore order, it was to transform the region so that future uprisings would be unthinkable. This is why later imperial records praise him not just as a general, but as a stabilizer, a civilizer, a man who brought law to disorder. But this framing hides the cost. Because what was stabilized was not peace, it was domination. What was civilizing was not progress, it was replacement. Ma Yuan understood that you cannot permanently rule a people who still remember themselves, so memory became the target. Language was pressured, rituals discouraged, lineages redefined. Even geography was altered, borders shifted, place names changed. What had once been the heart of resistance was slowly reclassified as imperial interior. This was not accidental. By absorbing contested regions into the empire's identity, the rebellion that occurred there could later be described as internal unrest. Not resistance, not liberation, just disorder. This is why Ma Yuan's campaign does not end with victory. It ends with silence. The silence of drums no longer sounding. The silence of leaders no longer gathering. The silence of records no longer written by the people themselves. And yet, even this silence speaks. Because the empire would not have gone this far if the threat had been small. Empires do not dismantle entire cultures to suppress footnotes. They do it when they are shaken. When the foundations crack. When something proves that imperial control is not destiny. Ma Yuan's legacy, then, is not simply conquest. It is containment, the containment of memory, the containment of identity, the containment of possibility, because if the South remembered what it had done once, it might try again. And that is the ultimate admission that the empire did not believe. It had defeated an anomaly. It believed it had narrowly survived a precedent. And so the cultural war began, quiet, systematic, relentless. Long after the battles ended, this war continued, in laws, in rituals, in silence, because when empires fear repetition, they do not just destroy armies, they destroy the conditions that make rebellion possible, and in doing so, they leave behind a question history still struggles to answer. If this much effort was required to suppress memory, how powerful was the reality it tried to erase? Every empire wants a clean ending, a decisive battle, a captured enemy, a public execution, closure. Because closure restores order. But what happens when history refuses to close? What happens when the ending fractures, splits into incompatible versions, each one contradicting the other? That is where control begins to fail. The final fate of the uprising's leaders should have been simple. Empires record victories meticulously. They catalog defeat with precision, names, dates, places. And yet here, at the most critical moment, the record dissolves. One account claims they were captured and beheaded. Another insists they chose death themselves, throwing their bodies into a river. Rather than submitting, another says they vanished entirely, retreating into the interior, never seen again, beheaded, suicide, vanished. These are not variations of the same event. They are mutually exclusive, and that is the point. When empires disagree with themselves, something is being hidden. If the leaders were captured and executed, why does no single account agree on where? If they committed suicide, why does the empire later claim victory through force? If they vanished, why does the empire insist they were destroyed? These are not gaps caused by time. They are fractures caused by control. Because each version serves a different purpose. Execution implies dominance. Suicide implies weakness and despair. Disappearance implies insignificance. But none of these versions explain the same thing. Why there was no public display? Why no triumphal inscription? Why no definitive monument to conquest? Empires do not miss opportunities to showcase victory, unless victory was incomplete. Unless the ending resisted ownership, the contradictions grow deeper. The closer you look, different officials report different outcomes. Different campaigns claim different results. Different timelines refuse to align. In some records, the leaders die early. In others, resistance continues long after. In some, the empire claims full pacification. In others, it admits years of pursuit and suppression. This is not confusion. This is narrative damage control, because the worst outcome for an empire is not defeat, it is ambiguity. Ambiguity invites questions, and questions invite memory. The empire needed the leaders gone, but more importantly, it needed the meaning of their resistance gone. A clean execution would have made them martyrs. A documented trial would have legitimized them. A public spectacle would have preserved their authority in memory, so the record blurs. Details dissolve, certainty disappears, and in that disappearance, control is attempted. Because when no one knows exactly how a story ends, the empire can insert itself into every version. But ambiguity cuts both ways. Because uncertainty also preserves possibility. If the leaders were executed, why did resistance not immediately collapse? If they committed suicide, why did their movement not disintegrate? If they vanished, why did the empire continue to fear repetition? These questions refuse to die, and they reveal something essential. The empire never fully controlled the ending, because it never fully controlled the uprising. Even in defeat, the movement resisted containment. Its leaders did not fit cleanly into imperial narrative categories. They were not criminals. They were not rebels without cause. They were not isolated actors. They were representatives of a society that had briefly reclaimed itself. And that society did not disappear overnight. Which is why, even after the campaigns ended, the empire remained anxious. It fortified borders, reorganized administration, rewrote geography. It spoke of peace, but acted as if the threat remained. Because unresolved endings are dangerous. They allow stories to evolve outside imperial permission. They allow memory to survive. In forms the empire cannot regulate: legends, songs, rituals. And those forms proved resilient, while official records hedged and contradicted themselves. Local memory became more certain. Not about how the leaders died, but about why they rose. That distinction matters. Empires prefer their enemies remembered as failures, but here, the focus shifted from defeat to defiance, from outcome to meaning. And that is precisely what the empire could not control. Because meaning does not require official approval. It survives in commemoration, in ritual, in silence passed down. This is why centuries later, the story did not disappear. It transformed. It adapted. It resisted the very erasure designed to destroy it. The empire won the battlefield, but it never won the ending. Because endings only belong to victors, when everyone agrees on them, and here, no one did. The final irony is this: by trying to control the narrative too tightly, the empire exposed its own uncertainty. The contradictions became evidence. The silence became testimony. The fractured record became a map of what could not be fully erased. Because if the leaders had truly been insignificant, their fate would not matter. If the uprising had truly been small, its ending would be clear. And if the empire had truly won completely, it would not have needed so many versions of victory. History does not fracture when nothing is at stake. It fractures when something threatens the foundation. And the inability to settle this ending reveals what the empire never wanted admitted: that the uprising was not just a moment. It was a rupture, one that could be suppressed but not sealed. And that unresolved rupture would echo far beyond the battlefield. This story does not matter because it is ancient. It matters because it is familiar, because the forces at work here, empire, domination, resistance, erasure, have never disappeared. They have only changed language. This wasn't just Vietnam's first rebellion. It was one of the earliest anti-imperial movements in recorded human history, led by women, against one of the world's largest empires, and almost erased. That combination alone should force us to pause. Because when history challenges everything we assume about power, about gender, about who gets to resist, it is usually pushed aside, not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient. Empires prefer stories that reinforce inevitability, that say conquest is natural, that domination is permanent, that resistance is futile. But this story says the opposite. It says empires can be shaken. It says control can fracture. It says societies labeled primitive can organize faster and more effectively than bureaucratic superpowers. And it says leadership does not always look the way history textbooks expect. 2 women did not rise because history allowed it. They rose because their society made it possible. That matters today, because we still live in a world shaped by empires. Some overt, some economic, some cultural, some informational. We still live in a world where dominant powers define which histories matter and which can be safely forgotten. Where resistance is often reframed as disorder. Where liberation movements are reduced to emotion. Where structural rejection is blamed on individual failure. These are not ancient techniques. They are modern strategies. When contemporary movements challenge power, the first response is rarely to engage the cause. It is to control the narrative, to personalize it, to trivialize it, to fracture it, because if a movement can be reduced to emotion, it no longer threatens systems, and that is exactly what happened here. The uprising was not remembered as a coordinated rejection of empire. It was remembered as tragedy, not strategy. But strategy is what made it dangerous. And strategy is what still frightens power today, because strategy implies learning. It implies repetition. It implies that what happened once could happen again. This is why memory is always contested. Why monuments matter. Why language matters. Why who tells the story matters. Because history is not just about the past. It is about permission. Permission to imagine alternatives. Permission to believe that the world does not have to be organized the way it is now. For American audiences, this story should feel uncomfortably close. Because the United States was born from resistance to empire, from a rejection of distant authority, from a refusal to be governed without consent. Yet even that story is often simplified, cleaned, stripped of complexity. And this is what makes the uprising we've explored so important. It forces us to confront a deeper truth, that resistance is not an anomaly in history. It is a constant. And it often comes from places power least expects, from the margins, from the colonized, from women, from societies written off as backward. The Han Empire believed it was civilizing the South. History books would later echo that claim, but civilization is not measured by conquest. It is measured by continuity, and the society that rose here had continuity long before empire arrived. It had leadership. It had communication. It had identity. Empire did not create order. It disrupted it, and the rebellion did not seek chaos. It sought restoration. That distinction is critical. Because restoration challenges legitimacy. It asks, who decided this world order was correct? Who benefits from it? Who enforces it? And who pays the price? Those questions never disappear. They reappear in every generation, in different languages, under different flags. That is why this story survived it all, despite erasure, despite contradiction, despite silence. Because stories rooted in truth do not require permission to endure. They move through memory, through ritual, through identity. Even when official records fracture, meaning remains. And meaning is harder to conquer than land. The uprising did not end with victory. It did not end with defeat. It ended with transformation. It forced an empire to change how it ruled. It forced history to work harder to hide it. And it left behind a precedent. That power never fully extinguished. That precedent matters because it reminds us that domination is never total, that control is never complete, and that even the most powerful empires are more fragile than they appear. 2,000 years later, we are still talking about this story, not because it was convenient, but because it was disruptive, because it refuses to stay small, because it refuses to fit, because it refuses to end cleanly. And that, perhaps, is its greatest legacy. Not that it succeeded, not that it failed, but that it proved something essential. That resistance does not require permission, that leadership does not require precedent, and that even when history is rewritten, the truth leaves echoes that no empire can fully silence.